One thing I'd just like to sort of say is that our work, I mean, I appreciate the words of the brother about this, but it is an obligation upon us. And one thing I would always say is that these might be trials and tribulations, and sometimes we can get very downhearted when we keep hearing stories like this. But really, these are more a test for ourselves who are supposedly free on the outside about what we are going to do. The people who are imprisoned or in these things, they're more a tribulation also to ourselves who have ability, who have voices. And that's one of the things we've always said about cage prisoners. We keep saying that our job is partly to give a voice to the voiceless. Now, I'll go back to our program, which is that I'm now going to bring in Imam Shams Ad-Duha. I think for those of you who are in East London know him very well. He's a director of Ebrahim College, well known as Imam and active in da'wah and also in activism. And he will be speaking about the life and times of the first of the Imams we should be talking about, which is Imam Abu Hanifa. Jazakallah khair.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Sallallahu ta'ala wa sallam ala Sayyidina wa Habibina wa Mawlana Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال رب السجن أحب إلي مما يدعونني إليه وإلا تصرف عني كيدهن أصب إليهن وأكن من الجاهلين صدق الله العظيم. I think what we will find as we proceed through this afternoon is quite an alarming similarity between some of the stories that we will hear about the Imams of the past and the kind of circumstances that they faced in their various trials and what is going on today. And shockingly, of course, in the Muslim world, as the brother's story just showed us. I had a brief trip in Syria before the madness started. And exactly the same story. A brother who'd gone from the UK to study. He was there with his family, with his wife and kids, and locked up because given that he'd gone to a new country, didn't know people very well. All he knew were other students. But because he'd spoken to apparently the wrong people, he was locked up for many, many months and then eventually released and sent back to the UK and not allowed to go back to Syria and complete his studies. So this idea of arbitrary detention and the kind of interrogations that take place, some of the questioning that when you hear the stories can only be described as silly, almost and ridiculous. But these things happen, and the key word here is arbitrary. If it's arbitrary, then pretty much people do what they like. The interrogators do what they like, the prison guards do what they like, the various officials, they do what they like. Because it's all arbitrary, there is no rule of law, there is no due process, nothing. Which is, of course, exactly why we're all here and why Cage Prisoners exists. So moving on to what I've been asked to speak about. Of course, Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, is the first of the four famous Imams. And of course, their story isn't unique. They weren't the only people who had suffered these types of trials and tribulations. But I think what we will all find difficult to comprehend and believe is the fact that people like that were imprisoned and tortured and punished. I won't go into the wider details of what Imam Abu Hanifa was like, because it's probably known to many of you. People like Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, their piety, their selflessness, their dedication to knowledge, their worship, etc. is very, very well known. I mean, these are stories that are on our tongues all the time. So what's shocking about all of this is the fact that these people end up being tortured, and the kind of veneration that we have for them for how they were like was very much acknowledged at that time. But what is it about those rulers that they couldn't see the same thing, that they were unable to see the same thing? But yet again, I'll echo what Sidi Abdul Samad said about the fact that it isn't about heroes and villains. And of course, most of the Ai''Immah, after they were asked later on, following their trials, they held no enmity towards the rulers and were able to just forgive them and move on, which is amazing. Abu Hanifa, his life straddles two substantial periods in Islamic history, two very, very strongly contrasting periods, of course. And that's the period of the Umayyads, which is one dynasty. Imam Abu Hanifa was born in that period. Of course, when he was born, some of the younger companions of the Prophet ﷺ were still alive. And this is the kind of period where he grew up, where he studied, where he traveled to study at the feet of various great luminaries and scholars of his time. And really, it was while the Umayyads were still in power that Imam Abu Hanifa began to be acknowledged as an Imam in his own right. People had come to study with him. He now had many, many students, and was regarded as one of the great, famous Imams and scholars of his time. People would come to him for his opinion. People would come to him to try to resolve difficult masail, new issues that had come up that people were struggling to find answers for. So this kind of profile of Imam Abu Hanifa had already been established. And then the second period, of course, is the Abbasid, the period of the Abbasids, of the Abbasiyun, which, when every time power moved in Islamic history, when power moved from one dynasty to another, that transfer wasn't a smooth one. It wasn't a general election, right? So it tended to be violent, lots of battles, killing, bloodshed, and so forth. If you haven't studied Islamic history and this strikes you, I'd like to kind of add a little caveat and say that those of us who think that Islamic history is this rosy picture all the way up until 1924, after which suddenly we were hard done by the West and by others, and then suddenly we lost this wonderful cherry kind of at the top of our cake, then you need to think again, because that was never the case. Islam was always about deen. It was always about submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it was always about, and the contrast was always about people who were deluded by wealth, people who were allured by wealth and power, and as a result resisted that. And it's about tyrant rulers right from the earliest of times. So as far as Islam's decline, Islam has, alhamdulillah, and to this day it remains strong as a faith, as a deen, as a way of life that informs every single one of us how we should live our lives. It doesn't matter the fact that we live under the government of David Cameron, and it doesn't matter that some of our brothers in Saudi Arabia live under the rulership of King Abdullah or any other Muslim or non-Muslim king or president or prime minister. What remains constant is the strength of Islam. That is constant, and it continues to grow. And even now, when it appears as though Islam is weak and so forth, that particular aspect remains constant. We get stronger and stronger and stronger in our deen. But the decline started early on, right from the 2nd century. You ended up with these types of problems. And just to kind of put everything into perspective, Abu Hanifa was born in 50 after Hijrah, 50 AH, right? So very, very soon after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, so there was this bloodshed, and whenever you have conflicts between different people, that kind of environment is very much the kind of environment where you get conspiracies, where you get people spreading rumors about who is on what side, who favors whom, etc., etc. And really, Imam Abu Hanifa's trial begins in that kind of context. Now, there's much overlap when it comes to, the story of Muhammad ibn Abdullah that Sidi Abdul Samad spoke about, and the story of the revolution that happened in that time under that person that he spoke about. I don't want to repeat it. Imam Abu Hanifa's story very much overlaps with that. It is well known that there were rumors at the time, unconfirmed, that Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, among the leading scholars of the time, supported Muhammad ibn Abdullah and his revolution. Of course, there is no evidence that this may have been the case. But anyway, that was something that was spread. And it was very much a rampant rumor at the time. This was at the time of the Khalifa Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, who of course was the person responsible for ultimately crushing that particular rebellion, as Sayyidi Abdul Samad mentioned. And at this time, people spread the rumor that Imam Abu Hanifa supported that particular rebellion and that particular revolution. And so, given that they were the biggest scholars of the time, Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, that they were the biggest scholars of the time, it was a significant issue, and it was something that Abu Ja'far al-Mansur felt that he needed to deal with it. So how does he deal with it? And this is a possible explanation for why al-Mansur did what he did and why he tackled the issue the way he tackled it. And I'll kind of go over it briefly. Of course, this particular crisis, this particular revolution, this situation in which these rumors are there that Imam Abu Hanifa supports a rebellion against the ruler, this isn't the first time Abu Hanifa faced tribulation at the hands of a ruler. Earlier during the Umayyads, at the time of Yazid ibn al-Walid, Umar ibn al-Hubayra, who was at the time the governor of Iraq, had called on Imam Abu Hanifa to take on the position of judge. Right? Imam Abu Hanifa refused. And how to explain why? Why would he refuse something like that? It is a position ultimately of power. It is a position of responsibility. Much good also can be done from that position. So there's money, there's one's financial security, there's a possibility that the work one is already involved in will go even further. And refusing qada, really, it's a personal issue, right? Imam Abu Hanifa refused it. His own student, Imam Abu Yusuf, took it on afterwards. Yeah, but what is it that Imam Abu Hanifa kept refusing? And I think if you want to understand Imam Abu Hanifa's anxieties, just reflect on the rulers. Because Umar ibn Hubayra's reaction to Imam Abu Hanifa not accepting this particular position was to threaten to beat him and to imprison him, which he did. Imam Abu Hanifa kept refusing, so he imprisoned him and beat him. And one of the stories goes that he said, I'll specifically beat you around the face and head. I'll specifically beat you around the face and head until Imam Abu Hanifa's head and face had basically swelled up. I mean, this kind of brutal torture. Why? Oh, I want to give you a job. Right? I'd like to give you a job. How about that? If you don't take it, you've had it. So I think when you consider these types of rulers, then it's understandable with somebody with the depth of insight and foresight that Abu Hanifa has, that he will understand that, yes, I'm going to take up this position, but how in the world am I going to independently judge based on what I feel to be right and fair? How am I going to implement justice when there's people like that behind me? Right? And I think this has to play a substantial part in the fact that Abu Hanifa felt that, I have to turn it down because there's absolutely no way, that I can do this properly. Right? And of course, generally, ulama didn't like it was generally frowned upon. In early Islamic history, people of piety and knowledge didn't like being close to the rulers unless, there were lots and lots of conditions that were met, and that they were fully convinced that their independence and their ability to be true to their ethical and moral standards, wasn't going to be compromised. Anyway, the reason why I'm telling you about Umar ibn Hubayra's story is because, of course, Mansur would have known this. He would have known this, though he thought, well, instead of calling him and interrogating him about, whether or not he supports the revolution or not, I'm just going to offer him the judge's role again. I'll just offer him the judge's role again and see if he accepts it or not. He'd already made his mind up that he probably did support the revolution. So he offered him the judge's role again. And of course, Imam Abu Hanifa once again refused, right? He once again turned it down. He, among all of the people who had been offered this, his story is, on the one hand, it's strange, and on the other hand, it's inspiring in terms of how kind of resolved he was to not take up a position that would give him fame and power. He just wasn't interested, and for him it was a personal decision for which he was prepared to suffer torture. He could have just said, okay, I'll accept it, but you can't interfere, right? Or something like that. But his personal conviction with regards to that was that I'm not going to allow my work and my life and my sincerity to be tainted by the lure of wealth, of power, of being close to government, of being close to the Khalifa or the king or what have you. Anyway, and this became his second and final trial. It's around 145 that this happened. At this time, Abu Hanifa is around 70 years old, right? He's kind of at that age. And when he refused, Mansur had various dialogues with him. Abu Hanifa said, I won't take it. He said, well, what? Are you trying to say that there's something wrong with us? That you're turning away from what we are doing? You're too good for this? So Abu Hanifa just politely, he continued to refuse. He was known for being very calm, by the way. Abu Hanifa was known for kind of being very, very calm. So he would have probably given a really, really annoying, calm response, right? And it would have probably riled the heck out of Mansur. Anyway, and Mansur said, well, you lie about whatever it is that you're saying. And Imam Abu Hanifa, this is very famous. He said, well, if I'm lying, then you've just argued my case and you've just proven why I'm not suited to the position. Because Imam Abu Hanifa's answer when he offered him the job was, La asluh. I'm not suitable. I'm not suited to this position. I can't do it. I'm not the right person for it. So Mansur said, you're lying. So he said, well, if I'm lying, then I'm definitely not suited. Right? And then he said, and if you take that back, and I'm telling the truth, right? I'm truthful, then I'm truthfully telling you that I'm not suited. All right? Anyway, I don't think that went down very well, right? He got imprisoned. And he was imprisoned and beaten every single day. There's various stories. Courtiers, ministers and people like that went to him, tried to convince him to take up the position. Imam Abu Hanifa didn't. And after 2 to 3 years of imprisonment, his resolve firm, right? His trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala firm. At the age of 70, his body gave away. At the age of 70, eventually his body gave away. And he passed away in prison. This is the man we call Al-Imam Al-A'zam. The majority of the Muslims in the world follow his jurisprudence, right? He suffered torture for years in prison at the end of his life and then eventually passed away in that same state. So what is it? What is it about rule, yeah, that it can lead to people like that being tortured? And in that, of course, there's lessons for us. That good people will get imprisoned always. It will happen. And it's not new. Even if you look in our recent history, look at what happened under the British Raj in India. Read up the story of the ulama of India and what happened to them. The torture that they suffered and how they were hanged from the trees. Right? And how Mahmud al-Hassan, Shaykh al-Hind, rahimahullah, was imprisoned for years in Malta. They say after he passed away, when they were washing his body, they found mangled flesh on his back. This isn't long ago. Mangled flesh on his back. And nobody knew. Everybody was shocked. What's this? Right? It looks like he's been whipped and beaten, right? So the people closest to him said, Well, he was tortured in Malta by the British. He'd been tortured, but he didn't want to make an issue out of his torture. He wanted everybody to stay on course of freeing India from British rule. And he didn't want the issue to become about him and about his torture. So he hid it from everyone. Right? So it's not new. These things will happen. Our issue is that the guilty will be found guilty if due process is followed. And the innocent will be found innocent if due process is followed. All of these stories of torture and imprisonment are stories of arbitrary detention, are stories of people exerting power because they can. People exerting power because they feel they're able to. Whether it's kings, whether it's presidents, prime ministers, whether it's officers, whether it's people in the intelligence community, it's because they have the power and they're able to do that. It's because that ordinary person doesn't matter. They're unimportant in the context of whatever it is that they want to do. So due process is suspended. You know, Guantanamo is the perfect example of it, where humanity just completely lost sight of its values, where technicalities, technical stuff, right? Technical rules and policies and loopholes were found to make an excuse for torture, for imprisonment without charge, right? And so forth. And people eventually getting released. Well, what happened to them all those years? But, you know, the loopholes were created so that that situation could be sustained. That, you know, something's gone wrong in our wiring inside if we begin to do things like that. And cage prisoners should be applauded for their work. It isn't about trying to establish who is guilty and who is innocent. No, it's about trying to make sure that due process is followed. Because if there's no due process, then that's what you get. You get this kind of madness, the kind of madness that our Imams suffered from. Right? The kind of torture that our Imams suffered from. And see, Abdul Samad spoke about the direction that we're going in is really a return. And it's, you know, somebody sent, I love this cartoon. Somebody sent a little cartoon strip, right? Of colonization, colonial times and post-colonial times, right? So the cartoon was, I'm sure some of you guys have seen it. You seen this? Yeah? So it's like, at the time of, in colonial times, it's the colonizer pointing a gun at the colonized and shoot him in the head, right? So it's like that. And then in post-colonial times, it's the same thing. The colonization is continuing, except that it's the colonized person that's holding the gun like this. All right? With the colonizer standing there. Right? So, you know, there is this delusion, this false impression of due process, right? Of the law being followed and so on and so forth. But then, how in the world is due process going to be guaranteed if the voter turnout in Western countries is 30%? You can get away with whatever you want. With that kind of turnout, you can get away with whatever you want. So ultimately, if things are going to be changed, it's going to be because we've become active. It's going to be because we don't speak with anger and emotion, but we're able to engage intelligently with other people and speak to them about what's good for themselves. Because today it's the Muslims. Tomorrow it's going to be the socialists, right? The day, and then the day after, you know, some other split in society is going to become intolerable, and it's going to be some other people, and they won't necessarily be Muslim, because once you establish that mindset, the mindset is what takes prominence, that's what takes precedence, and it is then unable to discriminate properly between who is one's own and who is the other. It all becomes really, really cloudy. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give cage prisoners the tawfiq to continue their work. I think ultimately the lesson for all of us to take is the lesson of just being active, just not allowing ourselves to become to live lives that are just about ourselves, not caring for other people. And I'd like to see the day when Muslims stand up for due process, regardless of whether it's a Muslim that's a victim or whether it's a non-Muslim that's a victim. We just stand up for justice, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders us to do so in those beautiful verses where He says, "O you who believe, stand up for justice," right? Witnesses witnesses unto mankind, and let not the enmity of other people turn you away from being fair. And in another verse, even if it is against yourself, وَلَوْ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَوِ الْوَالِدَيْنِ وَالْأَقْرَبِينَ, or even if standing up for fairness goes against your own parents or against your own relatives. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.